"Father to the left! Father to the right!" A voice rang out in a storm of steel. The Battle of Poitiers was going poorly, and the English had begun to encircle the French king's entourage. The day had started out well enough, with the King of France, Jean the Good, leading a far larger army and confident of victory. Yet fortune's wheel had turned that day. The French king sent his 4 sons away from the battlefield after things started to go south. But now he found his youngest, Philip, back at his side. The 14-year-old prince had returned of his own volition, but for all his courage, this prodigal son was only delaying the inevitable. "Yield, or you are dead." Another voice, this time in a French, tinged with a Picard accent. Jean II knew his foe spoke the truth. At this point, there was no hope of victory, nor any chance of escape. And so, on the 19th of September, 1356, the King of France yielded to the English and became the prisoner of Edward, the Black Prince. Though the battle had been a disaster, young Philip had earned his spurs. In honor of his battlefield exploits, the prince earned the sobriquet, the Bold, not to mention the lasting gratitude of his father, the king. Father and son alike would spend the next few years in England as prisoners, but upon their return to France, the prince was made the Duke of Turenne. For Philip the Bold, however, Turenne hardly sufficed. That is why only 3 years later, he would trade it for a different title, a title as old and venerable as its fiefdom was wealthy and bountiful. The king could not know it then, but in making his son the Duke of Burgundy, he created in one swift stroke the largest counterweight to royal power for the next century. Philip the Bold would go down in history as the architect of Burgundy's golden age, founding a new branch of the Valois dynasty. Wielding the levers of power like a Richelieu, playing the marriage game like a Habsburg, Philip expanded his sphere of influence into Brabant, Artois, Flanders, and elsewhere. Under Philip and his successors, Burgundy became a state within a state, at times effectively controlling France, at other times competing with it. Throughout it all, this fabulously wealthy duchy set the standard for European art, fashion, and culture. In the blazing summer heat, a dusky, thick-set rider flies across the land of blood and wine, leaving behind him a chalky plume of dust. The rider knows this journey well, and his eyes are shielded from the road's particulate by eyeglasses made of gold and crystal. "Il m'attend," he would habitually say, "I wait for no one." And judging from the Treasury's account book, with its column of horses worn out or killed in the services of Monseigneur, it was a motto he lived up to. The Duke of Burgundy was a busy man. He had made this journey on several occasions, riding 10 or 11 hours a day for 5 days straight, 186 miles from Dijon to Paris. I wait for no one indeed. The year after Philip became the Duke of Burgundy, his father, Jean II, died and Philip's older brother Charles ascended to the throne. While Jean the Good's reign had been a disaster for France, Charles V's would be a period of recovery. As such, he became known as Charles the Wise, but this wisdom was owed, at least in part, to his brothers, Louis, the Duke of Anjou, Jean, the Duke of Berry, and Philip, the Duke of Burgundy. He was further aided by a collection of highly competent advisors, especially his famous constable, Bertrand du Guesclin, the Black Dog of Brocéliande. Over the course of the 1370s, the English conquest would be reversed, the French administration strengthened, and the royal budget balanced. Though he was the youngest of his brothers, Philip loomed large in the background. His position as Duke of Burgundy made him the first peer of the realm, the leading noble of France. After the cataclysms of the 14th century, which you'll recall from our last chapter, it took a great deal of time and energy for Philip to re-establish order in Burgundy. Despite this, the Duke was often to be found at the French court, leading an army or negotiating a treaty on his brother's behalf. Upon the death of his brother, Charles the Wise, in 1380, Philip's involvement in royal affairs would only increase. He would join the Regency Council for his young nephew, Charles VI, which wasn't initially the plan. Originally, Philip's older brother Louis was to be the sole regent, while Philip and his older brother Jean shared the guardianship of the king and left the day-to-day to Charles' old advisors. But this arrangement was not to last. Philip and Jean were unhappy with their roles as glorified babysitters, and Louis wasn't keen on sharing power with anyone. As such, it was Louis, the Duke of Anjou, who took the first step toward upending the status quo, making it fair game for his brothers to respond in kind. This, by the way, was entirely in keeping with the Duke of Anjou's character. When Jean the Good and Philip the Bold returned to France after reaching a deal with England, Louis was sent to England to act as surety. Basically, the idea was that Jean II would raise enough funds to pay the agreed-upon indemnity, and Louis would be released afterward. But Louis had no intention of remaining a prisoner whatever the length of time, and his escape from English captivity threatened to reignite the war. To prevent this, Jean the Good willingly surrendered himself a second time to the English, thereby living up to his nickname. His refrain was that if good faith were banned from the earth, she ought to find asylum in the heart of kings. She certainly found no asylum in the heart of Louis. In 1380, he placed his personal agenda above that of France, just as he had 20 years earlier. But after the dust settled, the three brothers agreed to share the regency between themselves and the young king's maternal uncle, the Duke of Bourbon. Louis of Anjou was to be president of the council in name, but his powers would be limited. That was made clear during Charles VI's coronation. After Louis assumed a place by the king's side, Philip insisted that the seat should be his as first peer of the realm, elbowing past his brother to take the spot for himself. In the end, though, the power struggle between Anjou and Burgundy resolved itself fairly quickly. That is because Louis of Anjou acquired a claim to the Kingdom of Naples, spending the rest of his life attempting to press it. Having elbowed past Louis, Philip of Burgundy now dominated the regency, and admittedly, he didn't behave all that differently from Anjou, dispensing royal patronage and posts to his supporters, granting himself gifts from the treasury, and aiming the military machine of France against his foes, mainly those in the Low Countries. During the Middle Ages, the Low Countries were the place to be. Flanders in particular was the richest, most densely urbanized part of Europe, north of the Alps. The county was a busy and dynamic place, a center of trade and industry, and as such places often were, a hotbed of dissent and rebellion. The dominant Flemish industry was the production and sale of cloth. The leading towns of the county, like Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges, were major centers of cloth production, and Bruges was also the great marketplace of Northern Europe. In short, it was a fine bit of territory, provided you could control it. Count Louis of Mala's father had not been able to do that. He had died in exile after being chased out of Ghent by Jacob van Artevelde, who you recall from the last chapter. After Van Artevelde's fall, the Flemings invited the son to succeed the father, but less than a year later, history repeated itself. Ghent was up in arms, and Louis was on the run. But thanks to the help of his father-in-law, the Duke of Brabant, Louis of Mala was able to put down this revolt and maintain order in Flanders for the next 3 decades. To balance all of the competing interests and parties of the region, the Count had to walk a tightrope, especially with the big boys, France and England. While Flanders was technically a fief of France, it had a long tradition of independence and autonomy. It also enjoyed close economic ties to England, which is where it sourced the majority of the wool for its cloth industry. This put Louis in a tricky position. he had to avoid provoking French wrath while also maintaining the English wool supply, as the Flemish must have often reminded him, the wool must flow. Inevitably, this dilemma factored into the most important decision that Louis of Mala would ever make, choosing a successor. Though the Count had many sons out of wedlock, his only legitimate child was his daughter Marguerite, meaning that her husband would one day be the Count of Flanders. The two leading candidates for Marguerite's hand were royals, representing the two juggernauts in the 100 Years' War. One was the son of the English king, the other the son of the French king, and for years Louis refused to commit to one or the other. This frustrated another Marguerite, Louis's mother, who happened to be a French princess herself, as well as the Countess of Artois and the French Comte. In the end, it was this fiery matriarch that finally convinced Louis to make up his mind, and she would do it in a fittingly French way. As the Baron de Barante writes, Madame Marguerite, angered by the lack of control she had over her son, went to see him. As he still showed no signs of yielding, she suddenly pulled her dress to one side and, revealing her breast, said with passion, "Since you refuse to obey the wishes of your king and your mother, I intend, in order to shame you, to cut off this breast which fed you, you and no one else, and to throw it to the dogs. I would have you know that I hereby disinherit you, and that you will never have my county of Artois." The Count, deeply moved and alarmed, threw himself at his mother's feet and promised to give the heiress of Flanders to the Duke of Burgundy. Whether it really was his mother's ultimatum or some territorial concessions offered up by the French crown, Louis of Mala came around. In 1369, the 19-year-old Marguerite of Flanders was wed to the 27-year-old Philip the Bold. The Duke's wedding was the first of many occasions that dazzled contemporaries and chroniclers alike. A train of wagons carrying jewels, golden plates, jousting equipment, and casks of wine trundled into Ghent along with the Duke of Burgundy himself. On the day of the ceremony, Philip wore a blue robe of the finest quality, embroidered with golden daisies or marguerites that were a nod to his wife, just as the embroidered peas were a self-assured nod to himself. For all his travels, Philip closely attended to his dress and hygiene. He was one of those people that liked to dump bucket loads of cologne on himself, a more understandable habit in the days before running water. Yet even in those days, Philip had no problem affording a rosewater bath, as well as a violet fragrance concocted by his master of diversion. By the time he reached the altar, he must have been the best-smelling man in France. That being said, the ceremony was only one short chapter in the Duke's triumphal procession through Flanders. This was a chance for him to flaunt his wealth and create lasting relationships with the burghers and magnates he would one day rule. The next few weeks were filled with all manner of delights to the senses, jousts and feasts, archery tournaments, and casks of bon. But all the while, the everyday Flemish looked at this plump and sweet-smelling aristocracy with hungry eyes. As we talked about in the last chapter, the 14th century was a time of class conflict all throughout Western Europe. Life was hard for the average person, and hatred of the upper classes was brewing. France was hit especially hard. In Normandy, Picardy, Paris, Champagne, and Languedoc, country peasants and city folk alike took up arms in protest of high taxes and unfair treatment. The series of revolts would prove a litmus test for the Regency Council of Charles VI. While putting down a Parisian revolt, Philip the Bold was greeted with ominous cries of "Vive Ghent!" Long live Ghent! The most raucous city in Flanders had become a rallying cry for the disgruntled classes of France. In 1379, after 3 decades of relative peace and stability, Ghent rose up in revolt once again. Soon it would be joined by Bruges, Ypres, and other Flemish towns whose artisans overthrew their patrician governments. Louis of Mala was backed into a corner yet again. This time, his father-in-law was not there to save him, but a son-in-law was. By this point, Philip the Bold had made a name for himself, not only as the valiant warrior he had been in his youth, but even more so as an eminence grise, a skilled diplomat. After a month of negotiations, the Duke of Burgundy was able to establish a truce between the Count and most of the Flemish cities, Ghent being the only exception. In 1382, a new and even more radical faction came to power in the city, led by none other than Philip van Artevelde, whose father had led the first revolt over 30 years ago. Under this second Van Artevelde's leadership, Ghent went back on the offensive. But at the same time, the Count of Flanders gathered his forces in Bruges and prepared to storm Ghent. It took only one slip-up for the storm to come to him. During a local feast day, the freedom fighters of Ghent ambushed the drunken soldiers of the Count, per the famous French chronicler Jean Froissart. The men of Ghent and their close, solid ranks soon saw that the enemy were beaten and began striking them down in front of them, killing and going straight ahead, never once breaking formation, but marching on at a steady pace. They kept up their cry of "Ghent, Ghent," and said to each other, "Forward, forward, follow up closely, they're beaten and running." The militia of Ghent scattered Louis's army and stormed Bruges. Along with some artisan collaborators, the freedom fighters overthrew the local government and installed a new one. Another wave of uprisings soon spread throughout the county, and Louis of Mala was forced to flee Flanders again. This turn of events came as something of a shock to the Royal Council of Paris, and Philip the Bold was the first to suggest intervention on his father-in-law's behalf. Since Louis of Mala was not the most popular personality in Paris, the rest of the council showed more hesitation. But in the end, Philip the Bold got his way. Though the Duke's main interest was protecting his wife's inheritance, there were other reasons it made sense for the crown to intervene. As aforementioned, Ghent had become a rallying cry for French rebels. And on top of that, Philip van Artevelde had reached out to London in hopes of reviving his father's alliance with the English. Late in the autumn of 1382, a French army confronted the Flemish near the town of Roosebeke. Philip van Artevelde was confident of victory. The night before the battle, he's reported to have said the following to his lieutenants: "Tell your soldiers to show no mercy and to slaughter the lot. Spare no one but the French king. He is still a child, and he bears no blame. We will take him to Ghent, and there we will teach him to speak Flemish." Come the morning, a thick fog enveloped the battlefield until, according to legend, the oriflamme was unfurled, the most famous French battle standard. But none of this discouraged the Flemish from advancing, and for what happens next, we can turn to the chronicler Jean Froissart. As the Flemings approached, they began to fire big bolts feathered with bronze from their bombards and cannons, and so the battle began. The King of France's division met the first shock, a weighty one. Those Flemings, proud and in great heart, came down at them fierce and hard from the high ground, butting their pikes at them with all the force of their chests and shoulders as though they were wild boars, and they were knit so tightly together that their ranks could not be broken. The king's division was pushed back, but the vanguard and rear guard on the wings rode round and enveloped the Flemish so that they became very hard-pressed. The men-at-arms began thrusting at their flanks with their stout, long-bladed lances of hard Bordeaux steel, which penetrated their coats of mail to the flesh. Those who were attacked shrank back to escape the thrusts, for it would have been beyond human endurance for them to stand their ground and be impaled. They were rammed so closely together that they could not move their arms or use their pikes to defend themselves. Many lost strength and breath, falling on top of each other so that they collapsed and died without striking a blow. Philip van Artevelde was surrounded, pierced with lances, and borne down. In the aftermath, the French unleashed a long pent-up aristocratic fury, sacking the town of Crusade and reclaiming the spurs they had lost 80 years ago. It was a much-needed win for the flower of French chivalry. Bruges was their next target, but the city was spared after offering the army a massive bribe of 300,000 francs. By the time the French made it to Ghent, it was too late in the year to attempt a siege. Louis of Mala could take it from here, they decided. The outcome of the campaign satisfied Philip the Bold. In the aftermath, he commissioned a tapestry depicting the Battle of Roosebeke. It was a nice touch, immortalizing Flanders' defeat with something that may as well have been woven there. Instead of hanging it up on a wall, Philip used the tapestry as a rug. That way he could trot over the Flemish rebels for the rest of his life. Louis of Mala would die in 1384, 2 years after the Battle of Roosebeke. Upon his death, Ghent was still in open revolt, though isolated and contained. And so, while the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy did not succeed to a county totally at peace, they didn't inherit complete chaos either. The ever-diplomatic Philip would also speedily reach a settlement with Ghent, thereby eliminating the last holdout of Flemish opposition. In addition to Flanders, he and his wife inherited the Franche Comté and the County of Nevers, bulking up the flanks of Burgundy considerably. He also acquired the County of Rethel in Champagne and the County of Artois, which adjoined Flanders. These acquisitions, combined with his role on the Regency Council, not only made Philip the first peer of France, they made him one of the most important nobles in all of Europe. Shortly after becoming the Count of Flanders, Philip traveled to Brabant to meet with the Duchess Joanna, who happened to be his aunt by marriage. He also met with the Duke of Bavaria, Albert, the regent and soon-to-be Count of Hainaut, Holland, and Zealand. One must imagine that, en route to Brabant, Philip traveled at a much more leisurely pace compared to his sprints from Dijon to Paris. Not only was he accompanied by his daughter Marguerite, he had with him 248 servants and 232 horses, plus some hounds and falcons. Among the servants were jesters, singers, animal handlers, bakers, cooks, pâtissiers, and other personnel. In fact, the Duke had an advance guard of servants for getting a place ready for his arrival and a rear guard for cleaning up after him. They would also be lugging along all his stuff, including furniture, bedding, and interior decor, in case he wasn't happy with the feng shui of the castles he was staying in, I guess. Some of the Duke's most important personnel included the Maréchal, the Échanson, the Sommelier du Vin, and the Fritunier. The first of these posts, the Maréchal, dates back to the days of the Franks, and it's how we get the word marshal. Back then, this guy wasn't leading armies though, he was leading horses, meaning he was an equerry. Then there was the Échanson, or cupbearer. He was in charge of the wine. More specifically, he ensured the wine didn't run out, go sour, or get poisoned. His role was doubly important in a time before corks and bottles, when wine soured quickly once it was out of the cask. The cupbearer's job was to add the necessary amount of honey, spices, and herbs to make sure that no one noticed when it did go sour. Since wine was weaker then and diluted even further with water, a tradition stretching back to the ancients, you have to wonder how many glasses it took to get a good buzz going. That probably made the cupbearer's other job, washing the dishes, nothing short of a nightmare, especially after a big feast. The cupbearer played an especially important role during an occasion like that. He would be there to fill wine cups by order of rank and also to test for poison with a unicorn's horn. In reality, this horn was a narwhal's tusk, which apparently had the effect of making the wine fizz and bubble if it was poisoned. In case you're curious, something like that may have happened because of the tusk's porous surface or some residue inside it, but in all likelihood, this was one of those pseudoscientific medieval myths. Below the Échanson was the sommelier. Though the sommelier had the more inglorious role of transporting the Duke's many casks of wine, the name of this post is aged, well, like a fine wine. That is why, if you go to a winery today, you'll see a sommelier doing the job of an Échanson. Last but not least was the Fritunier, the snack master. This was the guy you went to for fruits and nuts, and because he was in charge of lighting the torches and candles as well, which the Fritunier had to make himself. Based on what the Duke achieved in Brabant, all the travel expenses were worth it. The three movers and shakers of the Low Countries, the Duchess of Brabant, the Duke of Burgundy, and the Duke of Bavaria, decided then and there to form an alliance, one that was sealed by a double marriage between the latter two. Philip's son John would marry Albert's daughter Marguerite, and Philip's daughter Marguerite would marry Albert's son William. Already by the 14th century, the branches of Europe's great families were getting pretty tangled. That meant that these two families may have had some common ancestors. Because of this, Philip secured papal dispensations of consanguinity from not one, but two popes, two because of the ongoing schism in the Catholic Church. Though the match cost Philip two of his bargaining chips, a daughter and a son, in the long run, this was a move even a Habsburg matchmaker would be proud of. The wedding, held on the 12th of April, 1385, was the very pinnacle of Burgundian pageantry and gastronomic excess. The Duke of Burgundy, his son, and their entourage were all dressed in suits made of the finest velvet and dyed with cochineal to produce a striking cherry red. This was the opposite of quiet luxury. Back then, the red and green liveries of the ducal household would have been an unmistakable signal of Philip's endless wealth. The golden gowns worn by his wife, daughter, and daughter-in-law would have had the same effect, while the crown jewels they were bedecked with, loaned for the occasion by King Charles VI, would have reminded everyone of Philip's royal pedigree. The wedding mass would be followed by a week of celebrations. One observer guessed that something like 20,000 people showed up. The inns all got booked up, the townhouses turned into hotels, and about 5,000 tents were pitched in the surrounding environs. It was, in other words, a little bit like the medieval Coachella. There were feasts and tournaments galore, thousands of animals hunted and cooked, all manner of Eastern delicacies gathered, and cask after cask of Burgundian wine popped open. Apparently, there were even table fountains flowing with the good stuff. The cupbearers and their assistants had truly outdone themselves, as had the Prevenier, who had made hundreds of candles and torches in the lead-up to the wedding. They were also on site to serve fresh and candied nuts and fruits, and would have been familiar faces to anyone with a sweet tooth. Philip's wife Marguerite, who loved a good cup of spiced wine, was probably in seventh heaven. All the more so because of the gastronomic harvest of the Crusades, as Bart Van Loo put it. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, sugar, bananas, oranges, lemons, dates, peaches, figs, and apricots. As for the harvest of the New World, those were obviously unavailable, with Columbus's voyage still 111 years away. That meant no corn, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, or chocolate, which put Burgundian chefs at a disadvantage compared to, say, Carmi Berzotto. But that didn't stop these medieval maestros from getting creative, perhaps too creative with the ingredients they did have. Our favorite Burgundian historian, Bart Van Loo, describes the ludicrous entremet or intermediate courses prepared by the Cambrai cooks. They stuffed pork bellies with strings of sausages that spurted out onto the table like grandiose rosary beads when the belly was cut open. They decorated bustards with precious stones, dressed hazel grouses in golden habits, served pork in the shape of a fish, fixed a cat's ears on a hare, attached a chicken's head to a rabbit's body, or cooked a dozen gigantic eggs in pork bladders. Try beating that, Carmi. Along with the food came minstrels and dancers, turning the feast into a full-scale production. For the grand finale, a peacock was prepared according to the following recipe. First, a master skinner would rid the beast of its jacket of feathers and skin. Then, cooks would stuff the remains with strongly seasoned minced meat. A wet cloth would be stretched across the eyes to protect the head, and the chef would impale the whole thing on a spit. When the bird was done, the cooks would dress it again in its ceremonial robe, gild the beak and legs, and work its tail feathers back into a fan. A kitchen boy would stuff a piece of cloth soaked in brandy into the bird's beak and then set the cloth on fire. Accompanied by the sound of horns, the fire-breathing peacock would finally be carried into the dining room in triumph. I guess no one ever told the Burgundians that it was bad manners to play with your food, but then again, they had their own forms of etiquette. Though they ate with their hands, they only used their first 3 fingers, including their thumb. They would also wash their hands between meals with bowls of water and towels brought by servants. According to Van Loo, spoons would have also been used, but never that instrument of the devil, the fork. Apparently, European attitudes toward the fork had soured considerably since the days of Theophanu. She, as those of you who watched the Ottonian video remember, was Otto II's Byzantine bride, and one of her claims to fame was introducing Germany to the fork. Knives, on the other hand, were perfectly acceptable, but if you were high enough on the social ladder, like say the king, the duke, or the bridegroom, someone would wield it for you. Interestingly enough, this wasn't a servant, but a nobleman, and though he wouldn't be tipped for the service, he did get first dibs on any scraps left behind on the High Lord's plate. As for the leading women, they would have been closely monitored to make sure they weren't overly into their food, or in the case of the Duchess, overly into her spiced wine. For medieval Europeans, this would have been what is called a red flag. Gluttony, after all, was one of the 7 deadly sins, and if you gave into that, who's to say you wouldn't give in to other passions as well? In any case, if the feast was a who's who of European nobility, the tournament was exactly that for the gentry. As Froissart put it, you can and must believe that wherever the French king and so many high and noble princes were present, an abundance of knights would come pouring in. These knights came not only from France, the Low Countries, and the Holy Roman Empire, but even from as far afield as Spain and Scotland. Jousting horses along with 1,000 lances were shipped from Paris to Cambrai. The grand prize of the tournament was a jeweled clasp, which was ceremoniously displayed on the Duchess of Burgundy's bosom before a winner was announced. In the flower of youth, King Charles VI took part in no fewer than 9 tournament bouts. Later that year, he would marry Isabeau of Bavaria, bringing the families of Valois and Wittelsbach that much closer. In those days, the king cut quite a dashing figure, a fact which makes his ultimate fate all the more tragic. Though the double wedding would pay dividends in the generations to come, for now it was time to count up the bill. The wedding set Philip back 150,000 francs, and the Duke of Bavaria, Albert, back about 40,000, enough to put him in debt. To put these sums into perspective, Philip had built a mighty castle at the port town of Sluis around this time. That had cost him 160,000 francs. But could Philip afford all this? Well, unlike Albert, he could. The Duke of Burgundy's annual income was 300,000 francs, meaning the wedding cost about half of what he made in a year. In the years to come, the Duke's income would rise further still to 500,000 francs. Flanders alone accounted for 35 to 48% of that, which is why its acquisition was one of Philip's greatest achievements. He also consolidated his territorial gains by cracking down on crime and hosting as many fairs, jousts, and archery tournaments as possible. These were basically the trade shows of the Middle Ages, indispensable for facilitating commercial and technological exchanges. It is also thanks to Philip's efforts that the Côte d'Or region experienced a revival in the wine trade. The Duke banned the cultivation of the Gamay grape, which he found overly bitter, and encouraged the cultivation of Pinot Noir instead. Better suited to the region's clay and limestone soil, it is little wonder why it became synonymous with a good Burgundian red. Today, the Golden Slopes still produce the best Pinot Noir and Chardonnay that you can find anywhere in the world, at least if you're judging by bottle price. Besides the wool and wine trade, as well as tax revenue, Philip had the keys to the royal treasury, and as the king's uncle, he wasn't exactly afraid of being clapped in irons for embezzlement.
In the end, Louis clapped them in irons.
All that to say, the Duke of Burgundy basically had an infinite money glitch. Thankfully, though, he used at least some of his wealth to patronize the period's leading creatives. These included the great-grandfathers of the Northern Renaissance, the painters Jean Malul and Melchior Bruderlam. They included the sculptors Klaus Sluter and his nephew Klaus de Verva, whose emotive stylings broke with their Gothic milieu. They included the writers Christine de Pizan, who wrote love poems and political tracts, as well as Jean Gerson, who wrote theological treatises. They included Eustace Deschamps, one of history's first war correspondents, who famously reported on the disastrous siege of Nicopolis, which we will recount later in this chapter. But Philip was just as keen on collecting things as he was on collecting people. A noted hoarder of curios, he invested in secular and religious subject matter alike. His collection included dozens of gilded reliquaries and crucifixes, a shard of the True Cross, the Psalter of St. Louis, and the sword of Godfrey of Bouillon. He also collected jewels by the cartload and kept a goldsmith on retainer. He had a cup that supposedly belonged to Julius Caesar, and a menagerie that probably was enough to impress even this Roman dictator. In this menagerie were horses, falcons, dogs, a bear, a porcupine, and even a leopard. But the most impressive thing the Duke possessed wasn't a relic, jewel, or animal, but the wondrous castle of Esden. Esden was filled with engines of amusement and medieval automata, mainly used for pranking Philip's unsuspecting guests. One room had a hidden trapdoor that would drop a guest into a pile of feathers one level below. Another room was basically a storm simulator, spraying water from the ceiling and mimicking the sound of thunder. The Middle Ages' best attempt at virtual reality, I guess. There were also pipes rigged throughout the castle that could spray visitors with water and flour, and there were walking and talking statues whose inner workings are best saved for another chapter. For now, they can keep their secrets. When the Duke of Burgundy inherited the county of Flanders, he also inherited its age-old dilemma, having to walk the tightrope between England and France. The good news was that the puppet master of France didn't have to worry about his relationship there. The bad news was that this very fact strained relations with England. For once, diplomacy wasn't an option for the Duke. That is why he decided to take the fight to England, as Napoleon would try to do over 400 years hence. The Flemish port of Sluis would be the staging ground for the invasion, and throughout the summer of 1386, thousands of shipwrights labored away refitting merchant vessels and building warships. By then, a French force had already made landfall in Leith to aid the Scottish rebellion against the English. Jean de Carouge, whose name you may recognize from the last duel, was part of this very detachment. Pretty soon, Sluis was abuzz with activity. 1,200 ships, 2,000 barrels of biscuits, 400 different cheeses, hundreds of livestock, tons of salted pork, smoked salmon, barley, rice, and almonds, and last but not least, 4 million liters of wine, all testified to the scope and scale of this logistical enterprise. There was also a curiously large amount of wood. Why? Well, not just for the ships, but, in the words of Bart van Loo, for a gigantic IKEA flat pack based on an idea of Charles VI. The English might have had clay, but the French would have a collapsible version made of wood. It was to be a mobile citadel, 22 feet high and closing off 1,235 acres in total. Philip's focus, meanwhile, was on his flagship. He commissioned the artist Melchior Bruderlam to adorn the mainsail with marguerites, another tribute to his beloved wife. And there in the middle of those daisies, why, his motto, of course, Il m'attend, I wait for no one. Except in this case, Philip was waiting on someone. He was waiting on his brother Jean of Berry, who disapproved of the expedition and was purposely late en route to Sluis. By the time Berry finally arrived, the weather had turned, and the invasion would have to be postponed indefinitely. Had it not been for you, Burgundy told Berry, we would be in England by now. In the long run, it was the Burgundians who benefited most from the Triple Alliance, the pact between Burgundy, Bavaria, and Brabant. However, it had been Joanna, the childless Duchess of Brabant, who had masterminded the alliance in the first place. She wanted backup in the on-again, off-again struggle that she was having with her neighbor, the Duke of Gelders. When in 1387 Gelders started causing trouble, Joanna called on her nephew Philip to support her, who in turn called on his nephew Charles to support him. Once again, the Duke of Burgundy was hoping to harness the French army to defend his interests in the Low Countries. He was hoping to pull off another Roosebeke. Philip's cause was greatly aided by the Duke of Gelders himself. During Gelders' correspondence with Charles VI, he dismissed the French monarch as only the so-called King of France and reserved that title for England's Richard II. Though most of the royal council resisted Burgundy's call to arms, the king's blood was up and preparations for a campaign began. As the army set off, Philip even chose the route that the army would take. Since he didn't want to put up with the responsibility of quartering the soldiers or the risk that they would loot his subjects, he had the army skirt around his lands and his allies. That was all well and good, except that it forced the army into an arduous march through the Ardennes forest. When the exhausted French soldiers finally reached Gelders, the Duke refused to give them the pitched battle that they had been counting on, hiding in his fortress instead. Since the French were too tired and ill-prepared for a siege, the king signed a peace treaty with the Duke and withdrew to Paris. In the aftermath, the Duke of Gelders kept quiet, not attacking Brabant again for another decade or so. As usual, the whole ordeal served to benefit Burgundy and his allies, and not so much the crown. Philip also saw to his reimbursement right away, double-dipping into the coffers of France and Brabant alike. Since Joanna could not afford the sum demanded, she promised Philip the Duchy of Limburg and some other territories in Brabant. In time, Burgundy would swallow all of it. After the Gelders incident, it seemed to many that Philip had gone a bridge too far. Many in the French court were unhappy with the outcome of the campaign, none more so than the king himself. Charles VI was nearing 20 at this point. It was high time that he took the reins for himself. And so, only a month after his return from Gelders, Charles, in first, outmaneuvered his uncles and began to rule in his own name. At a prearranged and likely pre-rehearsed assembly, the Archbishop of Laon urged the king to take charge, and he agreed. The Dukes of Berry and Burgundy were caught completely off guard and could only sit in stunned silence as the rest of the court cheered in agreement. For now, there was nothing more that they could do. The king was of age and determined to assert his own royal will. The days of siphoning power and wealth from France to Burgundy seemed to be at an end. The solo reign of Charles VI would prove to be one of the most turbulent periods in the whole of French history. Initially, though, things seemed to be going pretty well. After his scheming uncles were pushed out of power, a cadre of professional administrators took their place. These stewards, known as the Marmozets, had risen to prominence during the reign of Charles the Wise. They were career officials who believed in public service, a still rather newfangled idea by the time of the late Middle Ages. While there was a degree of corruption under the Marmozets, it was nothing compared to the graft of Charles' uncles, Burgundy and Berry. Despite the fact that the king liked to party, something he actually had in common with his uncle, Charles was willing to listen to his advisors. Thus, the first few years of his personal rule were those of effective administration. But this period was not to last. In 1392, the king suffered the first of his episodes. We can turn once more to Froissart, who described exactly what took place. The King of France was riding in the sun over the sandy plain on the hottest August day that has ever been known before or since. He was wearing a black velvet jerkin, which made him very hot, and had on his head a plain scarlet hat and a string of large milky pearls, which the queen had given him when he said goodbye to her. As the king rode on, he was approached by a hermit who uttered the ominous warning, "King, ride forward no farther. Turn back, for you are betrayed." The king's men shooed the hermit away, but his warning lingered in Charles' mind. In fact, it would linger there for the rest of his days. Quoting Froissart, Behind the king was riding a page who wore a Montauban helmet of burnished steel which glittered in the sun. Behind him came another page carrying a gilded lance on which was fixed a silk banner, the distinguishing mark of the king. Then, as they were all riding along like this, the page carrying the lance forgot what he was about or dozed off, and allowed the blade of the lance to fall forward onto the helmet which the other page was wearing. There was a loud clang of steel, and the king, who was so close that they were riding on his horse's heels, gave a sudden start. His mind reeled, and he imagined that a great host of his enemies were coming to kill him. Under this delusion, his weakened mind caused him to run amok. He spurred his horse forward, then drew his sword and wheeled round onto his pages, no longer recognizing them or anyone else. He thought he was in a battle surrounded by the enemy and raised his sword to bring it down on anyone who was in the way. He shouted, "Attack! Attack the traitors!" It was only after he had killed some of the nearby pages that the king was finally disarmed and restrained by his attendants. He was then taken to a nearby town to recover, but from then on it was clear to all that he was in no fit state to rule. Philip the Bold did not waste a single minute, rushing to Paris and becoming the acting ruler of France once again. The Marmozets were out, and the Duke of Burgundy back in. Charles VI would slip from sanity to madness for the rest of his life. Whatever happened that day in 1392 remains in many ways a mystery. It goes beyond some simple explanation like heat stroke, because as Charles grew older, the periods of madness grew longer and more frequent. Even during the fleeting moments of sanity, he would be tired, distractible, and impressionable. It's likely that he suffered from some form of paranoid schizophrenia, but it is impossible to know for sure. Some of his contemporaries speculated that he had suffered a crack in his brain due to the ongoing schism in the church, and that mending one would mend the other. Others thought that his youthful exploits and debauchery caused it. When the king was absent, a euphemism for these episodes, he couldn't even recognize his friends, family, or himself. At times, he seemed to believe he was a knight named George, perhaps St. George the Dragon Slayer himself. Sometimes he would get agitated like that hot summer day in 1392, and he would run through the corridors of the Hotel St. Paul, howling like a wolf. It all culminated in the king going full Howard Hughes, having the door to his quarters walled up and refusing to bathe or change for months at a time. These seem to have been the consequences of his most infamous fixation, the one that had him convinced he was made of glass and liable to shatter at any moment. Needless to say, it was a sorry state of affairs, a far cry from the prudent rule of his father, Charles V. But throughout it all, the people endearingly sympathized with their king. To them he remained Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. Only in the 19th century would he become known as Charles the Mad. It's a little bit reminiscent of Nero and Caligula, who had similarly been adored by the masses, but seemed to have been far crueler than Charles. The problem with Charles was the simple fact that he was stark raving mad, and because kingship in the Middle Ages was a fundamentally personal affair, that was a big problem indeed. The regency of a minor had been a temporary arrangement that could be waited out. A mad king, on the other hand, that made for a political situation as complex and volatile as the mind of Charles itself. This did mean that the Duke of Burgundy was back in power, but soon a new and aggressive rival emerged, the king's little brother Louis, the Duke of Orleans. In the years that followed the king's first absence, Louis was more or less excluded from power, but as the Duke of Orleans matured into a skilled political operator, he became more and more difficult to ignore. In 1393, back when the king could still recognize her, Queen Isabeau came up with an idea to cheer her husband up. She would throw a bal des sauvages, a ball of the wild men, in honor of her lady-in-waiting's third marriage. According to historian Barbara Tuchman, a woman's remarriage was an occasion for mockery and often celebrated by a charivari for the newlyweds with all sorts of license, disguises, disorders, and loud blaring of discordant music and clanging of cymbals outside the bridal chamber. There were also the wild men who wore costumes of linen cloth sewn onto their bodies and soaked in resinous wax or pitch to hold a covering of frazzled hemp so that they appeared shaggy and hairy from head to foot. These costumes, as I'm sure you can imagine, were extremely flammable, which was kind of the point. As they ran down torchlit halls, these wild men were playing a dance of death. Tuchman likens it to Russian roulette, and that's basically it. This was something for the young, dumb, and rich to do. Something like the gladiator pits of the late Roman Empire, where young aristocrats could also be spotted towing the line between life and death. As far as we know, though, nobody at the Queen's Ball really had a death wish. That is why she forbade anyone from entering the hall with a torch. For once, the Prevenier had the night off. But the king's brother Louis didn't get the memo. He burst into the hall drunk, carelessly approaching the 6 dancers with torch in hand. All it took was a single spark for 4 of the wild men to go up in flames. At the sight of this, the queen fainted. She alone knew that her husband, the king, was among the 6 dancers. Fortunately for Charles, he escaped the inferno by hiding under the Duchess of Berry's skirts. The 6th dancer saved himself by jumping into a vat of wine. The Bal des Sauvages had become the Bal des Ardents, the ball of the burning men. Over the course of the next few days, the 4 dancers died protracted, agonizing deaths. The people of Paris spoke out against royal excesses, and Charles and Louis were forced to perform a public penance. Rather than lifting his spirits, the ball would scandalize and scar the king, and soon he would slump into another of his absences. It was during Philip's power struggle with Louis of Orleans that the crescent of Islam began to loom over the distant kingdom of Hungary. Bit by bit, the Ottomans were expanding into the Balkans. Any month now, and they would be on the doorsteps of the Hungarian capital, Buda. Soon, the King of Hungary, Sigismund of Luxembourg, who you may remember from our video on the Hussites, began calling for a crusade against the Ottoman menace. Keen to participate in the glorious tradition of the Crusades, Philip vowed to answer the call for himself. But in 1396, it wasn't the Duke who set out to Hungary, it was his eldest son Jean, the Count of Navarre. Back then, the 25-year-old Jean was still a squire, but he would be accompanied by the cream of the French crop, most famously the Field Marshal Jean Lumengre, also known as Boucicaut. The Duke raised enormous sums to the tune of 520,000 francs, as well as 2 tons of gold for all the wrong reasons. Philip seemed to think of everything except for what really mattered. He even secured more papal dispensations as he had for the double wedding, this time for plenary indulgences, permission to eat and sleep with non-believers, and permission to attend Mass before dawn, according to Bart van Loo. As Barbara Tuchman eloquently wrote, since Philip was the prince of self-magnification, the result was that opulent display became the dominant theme. Plans, logistics, intelligence about the enemy came second, if at all. It was to be a crusade of style rather than substance. Jean's personal corps would number 700 squires, grooms, and archers who, according to Van Loo, were richly furnished with green satin tents, black satin doublets, and velvet horse blankets. Those of Jean himself were made of silk, interwoven with gold. But by the time Jean reached Vienna, he had somehow already burned through all of his father's money. To continue onwards, he borrowed another 100,000 ducats from the Duke of Austria. When the Crusaders finally assembled in Buda, the result was a pan-European assembly. There were Frenchmen, Burgundians, Hungarians, Transylvanians, Germans, and even Scots, Spaniards, Poles, and the Knights Hospitaller. Among them, it was the French and Burgundian forces who were hungriest for glory, as we will see very soon. By September of that year, 1396, the Crusaders converged on Nicopolis. Right idea, wrong execution. Nicopolis controlled an important section of the Danube River, but during the siege, the Crusaders sat around drinking and gambling rather than doing any of the boring stuff like building siege engines, fortifying their lines, or scouting the perimeter. Therefore, it shouldn't come as too much of a shock that the Ottoman Padishah, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, mustered his army with lightning speed, surprising the Crusaders only 2 weeks into the siege. Though initially the Crusader vanguard was able to repel the Ottomans, the situation quickly deteriorated because of their overconfidence. Despite Sigismund's suggestion to fall back and regroup, the glory-loving Burgundians surged forward up a hill under a hail of arrow fire. The Ottomans had planted stakes into this hill, and as some Crusaders tried their best to dodge and weave past them, others were unable to do so, having their horses' bellies ripped open beneath them. Soon the cavalry charge had lost all of its momentum, and it became clear that the Ottomans had the Crusaders completely surrounded. A great slaughter ensued, with the vast majority of Crusaders killed or captured. Among the prisoners, the Count of Nevers and Boucicaut. Meanwhile, the Hungarian rearguard didn't even get the chance to engage the Ottomans, having been intercepted by the Padishah's Serbian allies. Had the Crusaders stuck together, maybe things would have gone differently. The King of Hungary, Sigismund, was of course quick to point this out. "We lost the battle by the pride and vanity of those French. If they had believed my advice, we would have had enough men to fight our enemies." Sigismund, of course, had his bias, but even our war correspondent friend Eustace de Champs had to agree that the charge was the very height of Burgundian pride and folly. But even if the battle itself was a total disaster, Jean of Nevers supposedly fought as bravely as his father had at Poitiers, and for this, he earned the nickname Jean Sans Peur, Jean the Fearless. Nonetheless, he, along with the rest of his companions, had been forced to surrender. Had they been fighting the English, that would have been the end of it. Except, they were not fighting the English. They were fighting a foe with a different culture and a different faith. A foe hell-bent on revenge because of the cruelty with which the Crusaders had treated their Muslim prisoners. Because of his knowledge of Turkish, the Frenchman Jacques Douai was instructed to point out those on his side who would fetch the highest ransom, about 30 men in all. The less fortunate were sold into slavery, about 300, and the least fortunate, God knows how many, were put to the sword. Once proud knights were stripped naked, gathered into groups of 5, and hacked to pieces with scimitars. Jean begged Bayezid to spare his friend Boucicaut, the French field marshal. The two of them joined the rest of the privileged few and were shipped to Bursa, barefoot and humiliated. When the first survivors found their way back home to France, they were greeted with scorn and disbelief. The flower of French chivalry crushed beneath the Turkish boot? There was simply no way. These men were surely deserters, and they would have to be thrown in prison. But the truth could not be hidden forever, especially after more and more survivors stumbled their way back home and kept on telling the same story. Sooner or later, France would have to face the facts, as would Philip's family. Jean's wife, Marguerite of Bavaria, collapsed in shock. Jean's mother, Marguerite of Flanders, mourned the loss of her half-brothers who had died at Nicopolis. And Jean's father swallowed his paternal anxieties by raising a massive ransom for his son. Fortunately, Philip understood something that his Lucchese banker, Dino Rapondi, understood also, that there is nothing that cannot be fixed with gold and money. The price demanded by the Padishah was steep, but Allah knows the Duke could afford it. After a few months spent in Ottoman custody, Jean and his surviving companions began the long trek back to Burgundy. The Padishah's words must have echoed in the Count's mind. "Jean, I am well informed that in your country you are a great lord and son to a powerful prince. You are departing and can look forward to many years, and as you might be blamed for the ill success of your first attempt in arms, You might desire to wipe out this blot and regain your honor, and summon a powerful army to lead against me and offer battle. If I feared you, I would make you and your companions swear on your faith and honor that neither you nor they would ever bear arms against me. But no, I will not demand such an oath. On the contrary, I shall be glad that if when you return to your country, it pleases you to assemble an army and lead it hither. You will always find me prepared and ready to meet you in the field of battle. What I now say, repeat to whomever you wish, for I am ready for and desirous of deeds of arms and of extending my conquests. It was a powerful declaration of Ottoman might, and sure enough, Jean the Fearless never returned for a rematch. But had he done so, he wouldn't have faced Bayezid. 6 years after Nicopolis, the Padishah would face his own disaster at Ankara, spending the rest of his days as a prisoner of the Turco-Mongol prince Timur. No ransom would help Bayezid, and so it seemed that there were still things that money and gold could not solve after all. In 1398, 2 years after his departure, Jean the Fearless was back in Burgundy, holding his 1.5-year-old son Philip in his arms for the first time. Soon little Philip would be ambling around dressed like an Ottoman Padishah. Just as Napoleon's expedition to Egypt made everything Egyptian fashionable in Paris, now Jean experienced a brief spell of Turkomania. Jean had come back with Turkish weapons and emissaries, some of which decided to stay and be baptized into the Christian faith. Meanwhile, the Burgundians who had accompanied Jean to the east formed a kind of Nicopolis mafia. Their bonds forged in fire, the group would play an important role in the duchy's future. As for Jean himself, he received a hero's welcome. Philip made sure of that. All across Burgundy, the prodigal son was met with open arms and widened eyes. Feasts were hosted, tournaments held, all the usual stuff. The Duke even founded an order of chivalry, the Order of the Golden Tree. It was a predecessor of sorts to the Order of the Golden Fleece, which would be founded about 3 decades later by none other than Philip Jr. In time, the disaster at Nicopolis faded away like a bad dream. The paladins of France had still not learned their lesson. Not after Cressy, not after Poitiers, and not after Nicopolis. That is why, not 20 years hence, they would repeat their mistakes at Agincourt. Part of the reason that Jean led the Crusade rather than Philip was the rising tension between the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans. Philip could not risk a prolonged absence from France. After all, who knew what Louis of Orleans was capable of in his stead? Every aspect of the kingdom's governance became a battleground for the dukes. Patronage and court appointments, alliances and foreign affairs, church matters and judicial rulings, and tax rates and trade policy. Louis of Orleans had an acquisitive streak that matched his uncle's, not shying away from plundering the royal treasury. Like him, he was also always on the lookout to expand his domain, even at France's expense. Louis's lands were mainly in the center and southwest of the kingdom, so you might think that the Duke of Orleans would leave the northeast to his uncle. But no. Louis gained control over the bishopric of Tournai, right on the border of Flanders. He purchased a mortgage for the Duchy of Luxembourg, and he bought, with dubious legality, the lands of Coucy and Soissons in Picardy. Moreover, he formed alliances with Philip's enemies, most notably the Duke of Gelders. In the close of 1401, things came to a head when Philip left Paris to deal with a situation in the Low Countries. Orleans made the most of his uncle's absence. He removed men loyal to Philip from government posts and replaced them with his own creatures. He promoted policies which benefited him but hurt Burgundy. And he made sure that the Parisian garrison was stocked with his own loyalists. Henceforth, Louis planned to totally exclude his uncle from the French government, thereby drawing a line in the sand. No longer was their beef confined to the backrooms of the court. Now, everything was out in the open. Philip knew that he had to force the issue, and when he returned to Paris, he did so in force, with a company of 600 soldiers at his back. Over the next few months, both dukes continued to summon vassals and retainers to Paris, fortifying their residences as if they were playing a game of Guild 3. But civil war was not in the cards, at least not yet. The two dukes were more reasonable than that and agreed to an arbitration in early 1402. Both sides dismissed their increasingly expensive private armies and saved face while doing so. Yet in subtle ways, the struggle for preeminence would continue over the next 2 years. Sometimes Burgundy would get his way, other times Orléans would get his, but for the period the two remained evenly matched. The situation would only be turned on its head in 1404, when Philip the Bold passed from this life to the next. With his uncle out of the way, Orléans would reign supreme, at least for a while. Philip the Bold would be buried in the charter house of Chaumont, a Carthusian monastery he intended to be his family's mausoleum. Chaumont was a large and magnificent convent, twice as large as a standard Carthusian monastery and elevated with the finest craftsmanship of the age. The Duke of Burgundy had been a lover of luxury all his life and a notable patron of the arts. The charter house was his finest commission. Inside it were some of the most impressive sculptures of the Middle Ages, particularly the Well of Moses and the Duke's own tomb, the work of Claus Sluiter and his nephew Claus de Verve. The whole thing was more than a little ironic. Here was Europe's best-dressed man, a patron known far and wide for his decadence, resting in the habit of a Carthusian monk, an order famous for how strict and poor it was. Even in death, I guess, the Duke wanted the very best. Maybe not in terms of his clothing, but certainly in terms of his magnificent surroundings. Plus, who wouldn't want the strictest monks of Europe praying for the sanctity of their eternal soul? In the final verdict, Philip the Bold was a greedy, acquisitive man, but he was also a visionary. He was self-interested, but he was also a family man, often showing a touching concern for those around him. As the French court writer Christine de Pizan wrote, "We're really going to miss the good Duke of Burgundy." A lover of life, especially its finer things, it is possible, to put it lightly, that Philip overspent. But he also understood the value not just in being rich, but in being seen to be rich. Remember, there is nothing that cannot be fixed with gold and money, at least for now. That was his banker's motto, but it may as well have been Philip's, fitting him as snugly as "I wait for no one." In the end, though, Jean the Fearless barely had enough cash on hand to pay for his father's funeral. No matter, he had Burgundy, he had Flanders, he had the foundations of the old kingdom of Gundobad. The only question now is what he was going to do with it. Thanks for watching. The script for this video was co-written by Josh from the Grand Dukes of the West, the best podcast out there on Valois Burgundy. Go check it out if you're hungry to go deeper, and stay tuned for the next 3 episodes in our Burgundy series. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.